This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live.
Hello and welcome to the Friday Twilight Show. I'm Claire Cannon and thank you for joining me whether you are here live or listening to the podcast. How many of you are finding that SEND needs are going through the roof, both numbers of students and complexity of need? But what about when your SENCO is neurodivergent themselves?
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live. Tune in live at ttradio.org, or to join in the conversation, download the Podbean app and search Teachers Talk Radio. Follow the hashtag TTRadio. Tune in, talk it out with Teachers Talk Radio.
Thank you, and once again, it's good to have you here. Thank you for being here, especially if you're listening live on a Friday, which for a lot of people is also the beginning of a very welcome half-term break. For some of you, it might be the final Friday, it might be towards the end of your half-term break. Thank you if you've taken the time out of your holiday to listen as well. I'm really excited about having Anita Hempenius join me later in the show. Anita is a SENCO. We all know that SEN, special educational needs and disabilities, are rising. They are causing increasing numbers of challenges for schools. And Anita, is at the sharp end of that as a SENCO herself. But interestingly, and this is why I'm really excited to speak to her in a short while, Anita has neurodivergence herself. She's very open about her ADHD, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what she has to say. I can see she's just joined into the studio, so welcome, Anita. I will get you added in a short time as a speaker. But to hear from someone who not just gets it because they have an interest in SEN, but actually gets it from the sense of a lived experience as well. And not only have we got Anita sharing her lived experiences of being a SENCO and having neurodivergence, but also Anita's going to spend some time talking to us very kindly about her experience of what happens when school goes a little bit wrong. And she's going to share what happened with her daughter and some choices that she made to support her education, which are perhaps very different to what most people would potentially do. But before Anita joins us, I just want to put in some context around SEN and in particular ADHD. So, overall prevalence, where are we at? Yes, it's something that feels like it's very common. ADHD is estimated to affect between 3 and 5% of children in the UK. That is school age children. So this works out as around 400,000. So, you know, if you've got a class of 30, you are more than likely to have at least one student with ADHD in your room. Now, as with lots of neurodivergent conditions, lots of diagnoses, you are more likely to be diagnosed if you are a boy. And the ratio of boys to girls in terms of ADHD is 3 to 1. And this is still something that's being unpicked. Some people believe and have sort of thoughts around, is it to do with um, chromosomes and genetics and the differences between boys and girls? But there is also a school of thought around the fact that girls may mask in a similar way to they can do if they have autism. And also, there is more of a tendency for boys to be very overt in their presentation. So they quite often will be seen, their behaviors will be more visible, more visibly different to that of their peers. And they will therefore be diagnosed with the impulsive type of ADHD, whereas girls are more likely to be diagnosed with the inattentive, which can sometimes be seen as quiet type, or the hyper focus and or so they are people who are perhaps going to be less obvious, but that doesn't mean their needs are any less important or needing of support. Yes, it is also true that the number of new ADHD diagnoses has been rising. And a lot of this, I think, comes down to greater awareness, which is really good because if we know who these people are, in theory, we can be putting support in place. What we know is that sometimes that can be really challenging, whether that is because you have a student that's needs are significant enough that they need an EHCP, and that's a whole new ball game in terms of getting that paperwork and everything in place for that to happen, or whether they are somebody whose needs can be met within school at send support wave one, however your school calls those sort of students. But that's not always actually happening, and a lot of young people are perhaps not receiving the level of support that they really need. Now, as those numbers go up, that's obviously diluting what is already available, and we know that that's not enough necessarily. So, this is something that really does need looking at. And when we hear from Anita later on, I'll be really interested to see what thoughts she has around that. Um, Something else that is, we need to think long term. This is not something that's going to go away anytime soon because there is a backlog. Anybody that's waiting for an ADHD diagnosis will know that it can be anywhere from 6 months to, in some cases, over 2 years, depending on the region in which you live. It is one of those things that's become a little bit of a postcode lottery, unfortunately. Um, and there is, in one particular area, it has been as long as 3 years. And you think that's half of primary school, that's half of secondary school, depending on when the student was, brought to the attention of people who make the referrals. And interestingly, the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, so NICE for short, their guidelines recommend timely intervention. We all know that prevention is better than cure. Getting in there early is going to be the thing that can make a real difference. But sometimes that's not happening because either we don't know the full extent of a young person's difficulties because they haven't been able to have those assessments, or the people that are making a diagnosis, and for some young people that might be down a medication route, they can't have that support until that diagnosis is in place. So we then end up with students with ADHD more likely to get excluded from school. And that's a really difficult situation because, I've been in these, I've been in classrooms 20 odd years. I completely understand how challenging it can be when you've got somebody whose behavior is outside of what you would expect, outside of our sort of social norm. But can they help it? And it can be really difficult. Someone with a diagnosis can still make choices. It can be really difficult for staff to unpick, especially when you're trying to manage a room of 30 students where others may also have needs as well. And again, I'd be interested to hear from Anita on this, from her perspective with the lived experience. But it is true, sadly, that suspensions and exclusions are significantly higher because a lot of the time, the behaviours that are typical of somebody who has an ADHD diagnosis are also the behaviours that don't always go down well in the classroom. And for that reason, they end up, receiving consequences. And when you think about it, those consequences are unlikely to work because you're giving a consequence to someone who can't necessarily help or have much ownership at that point over what it is that they've done. And I say that also working in an SEMH provision now, where I see this every single day. Students who like to sit on the floor to do their work. That might be a sensory thing, it might be a grounding thing. But in a mainstream classroom, that can be something that's quite challenging. It also puts, an element of peer pressure on that young person when others around them might think, well, what are you doing? Why are you sitting on the floor? So then they might try and choose to ignore their own need because they don't want to be seen as different. So there's a whole lot of different factors at play, which is why there is no one simple solution to all of these different challenges that we are facing. Um, Interestingly, when I was looking into the sort of background to put this context in for you, is that in London and larger cities, they tend to report a higher rate of ADHD, which is, you know, I don't know. I sort of started thinking about why that might be, because in a city, you're going to have a whole range of socioeconomic backgrounds, a whole range of different cultural influences, all sorts of things at play that perhaps you wouldn't have in a smaller, quite often more rural community. So, yeah, something there. Perhaps I will go away and look at that a little bit more as to what is going on and why it is the case that people in cities tend to have a higher incidence of reported ADHD. Um, just a couple of other things to touch on. Um, we've talked about the lack of support. We've talked about the waiting lists. An interesting anecdote was shared with me this week by a parent, not of a child at a school where I work, but somebody else, and their child has ADHD. And they shared that the child had been given a target. And I don't know if Anita is going to send me any reaction to this in the text at all, but their child had been given a target, as I say, bearing in mind they've got ADHD, of sitting still and concentrating. Now, this target was given by the SENCO, shared with the parent through an IEP, individual education plan. And the parent's comparison and response back was, that's like telling a wheelchair user that they need to start using the stairs. You're putting a target in place that isn't realistic. So it's not smart, first of all, because it's not something that's really going to be achievable for that young person. So you're setting them up to fail before um, you even begin. Yeah, Anita, I thought you might comment on that one. Target should be for the teachers, not for the child. That's an interesting comment. And what I want to do, Anita, because I'm mindful that you have come straight from another commitment and given up your the next part of your evening to be with us today. So we're going to hear from our sponsors, and then we will hear from you, which I'm really looking forward to doing. So back in a minute, once we've heard from our sponsors, to hear from Anita with all her thoughts on things around being a SENCO when you are also neurodivergent yourself.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
Are you a teacher who has concerns about your students' low reading levels? Are you also worried disadvantaged students won't be able to catch up? The online reading development program, Dreambox Reading Plus, adapts to a student's skill level, accelerates reading progress, and helps students acquire a wide vocabulary. The patented technology develops reading fluency and supports the transition to increased text complexity from Key Stage 2 to Key Stage 3 and 4, where language and vocabulary are more challenging. You can try the program with a free 4-week pilot today. Search Reading Solutions UK to find their website and request your free pilot.
How do we stop teachers marking books on their kitchen table on a Sunday night instead of wanting to spend time with their family? Is live marking truly cutting-edge practice? What if I told you that I could provide evidence of verbal feedback and its impact on student outcomes? Now, traditional marking, time and time again, is reported as the #1 reason why teachers leave the profession. It trumps behaviour issues and teacher salary. In Guide to Feedback, I share 9 case study skills that demonstrate 9 different ways to provide marking and feedback, all evidenced by student outcomes. Now, not every school will be ready for this, but hopefully you are ready to start your Feed Up and Feed Forward journey.
The Teacher Toolkit Guide to Feedback is out now, and you can get an exclusive 30% discount when you order Teacher Toolkit Guide to Feedback from Bloomsbury.com. Just use the code TTRGTF at the checkout. That's TTRGTF, and it expires 30th of November. Happy reading.
Do you ever wish you could sit down with other teachers and delve into the challenges and opportunities we face? Well, that's exactly what Table Talks at Bet UK is all about. Join small roundtable discussions based on your selected topics to share insights, learn from peers, and tackle the big issues in education, all in a sponsor-free environment. This is your chance to connect and collaborate like never before. Be part of the conversation at Bet UK in January 2025. Visit uk.betshow.com to learn more.
Thank you very much to our sponsors for their support of us here at Teachers Talk Radio. We are talking today about ADHD in schools, and I am really excited to hear from Anita Hempeñas, who is joining us to talk to us not just about her role as a SENCO, but her role as a SENCO when you have ADHD yourself. Anita, before I say too much, I think probably the best thing is to welcome you in. I hope we can hear you loud and clear. Let's see if we can hear from Anita. Hi, Anita.
Hi, and thank you for inviting me because I'm really quite excited being here.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for giving up your evening. I'm glad the technology works. That's always the scary bit for me is when I first invite the guests to join, is can we actually hear you? Um, Anita, you've had a busy evening, so you know I do appreciate you being here. It's really excited to talk to you, and I'm sure you've got lots to say. So, could I just start by asking you to introduce yourself a little bit and share with our listeners kind of who you are, what you're about, and a bit about your role?
Yes, so I have two roles. So I'm ADHD myself,
Yeah.
and I've been a SENCO for quite a number of years, and then was diagnosed with ADHD about 5 years ago, and then delved into the ADHD, and also now do ADHD coaching. So it's two roles, which is actually very common for ADHDers, interestingly enough, because we need variety.
Mm,
So as a Senko, I have must have, I'm just trying to think, um, about 10, 15 years, 10 years probably, more like.
yeah.
I've been a Senko for about 10 years. And before that, I was a class teacher, and I've had classes with somehow always with a lot of neurodivergent children in it.
Mm, yeah.
Um, whether they just seem to be attracted to me, I don't know. So I have a lot of experience in both sides, which is why
Yeah.
I feel that I can really talk to the class teachers as well, because I know what it's like.
Yeah. And I was sort of quite curious actually to explore that a little bit more and is think about how your experience of having ADHD, which I know this might sound obvious to say, but you've always had it, even though your diagnosis is fairly recent.
Yeah.
How has that experience perhaps shaped your role or your approach to your role as a Senko?
I guess it has fine-tuned it rather than shaped it, because I've
Mm,
always worked from my very early teaching onwards. I've always really specialized in working with children with special educational needs, whatever it might be.
yeah,
Um, and so, because of that, it's always been an interest of mine. But learning more about ADHD because of my own ADHD means that I know a lot more of the sort of minor differences.
mm,
Things like, for example, the fact that um, time is one of these really strange concepts for ADHD, is because we don't experience time in a linear fashion. And so the whole um, thought of, planning for the future, anything, just doesn't exist.
that's a really interesting point, and I think something that is perhaps quite new to a lot of our listeners, because you hear a lot about ADHD in terms of the impulsive side, that could be blurting out answers, it could be, the movement, you're getting out of your seat, walking around the room. But that's something a little bit different, and I wonder what it is that you do experience if it's not that time is linear. What do you experience instead?
What I experience is that time stretches or contracts. Um, so it's like I've heard it being described as um, time is either now or not now, and now is about 4 seconds long. So we're either in
Wow.
the present right now or
Yeah.
it is not there.
That's that makes so much sense when I reflect on some of the students that I work with, and we talk to them, particularly the year 10s and 11s, about their plans for the future, for their career, and they genuinely just don't know. And I wonder
No,
if
and there's
that's
another part.
linked to what you're saying.
Yeah, no, it is. But there's another part as well, because one of the big things that so many people don't understand about ADHD is that our executive functioning skills development lags behind by about a third. So when these 10 or 11, year 10 or 11 students are doing their exams, it's like asking 11-year-olds to do it.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think again, thinking back to last year, the year before, when I was supporting GCSEs, actually those students who do have that diagnosis, you plan for things like movement breaks, you plan for things like, perhaps they need to be in their own room so they can stand up if they need to, or stretch out, all of those kind of things. But actually it's much deeper than that, isn't it? I think there's a lot more
Yes, it is.
going on that
Yes,
perhaps we don't
because
see.
because very often one of the things that happens is that these students, by the time they're about 18, they think they're stupid,
Mm, yeah,
and because of
and
that, they
I
think
can
they'll never be
see,
able to manage.
yeah, and I can see how that kind of pattern would be built up over time, because I suppose we have a tendency to compare ourselves to those around us, rightly or wrongly. But if you're constantly comparing yourself to people who are neurodevelopmentally ahead of you, you're always going to feel like you're not good enough, aren't you?
Exactly. Whereas in reality, what it means is that we develop it slower, but it doesn't mean we don't get there. I mean, I had that myself. I did my degree in my early 30s because by that
Yeah.
point I was ready.
Hmm. And that just goes to show, doesn't it? I mean, we talk about one size doesn't fit all, and phrases like square peg in a round hole, and you know, you don't all have to do the same thing at the same time. But that really goes to highlight just how important it is that actually we do think about a complete shake up almost of what we're expecting of our young people at different points in their lives. Because if they just aren't developmentally ready, then is it really appropriate to ask them or to expect that of them? And interesting what you said there about waiting until you're in your 30s to do your degree. Um, Anita, at the beginning of this show, I was talking about some of the statistics and some of the issues and things that happen in the classroom, and particularly around behaviours where they do challenge the social norm, they do challenge classroom expectations, and for a lot of students, sadly, that ends up escalating to the point of a suspension. And I just wonder what your thoughts are on how we can change that trend, what we can do differently.
Yes, the school where I work for now, we've developed a behavior policy that is based on the needs of the child. And I think that's really vital.
Mm,
So the first thing is in the classroom that the teacher will look at the child and see what is a need that's not being addressed. And with ADHD, it probably is something to do with movement.
Hmm.
They're not getting the movement, or they're not interested. Because
Yeah.
again, we're an interest based, we have an interest based nervous system. So it's those things that then are put in place first, which means you're already cutting down a lot on sort of behavior that you don't want. And then
Yeah.
after that, it might be that the child, for example, can't focus and is then distracting everyone else. It means the next step would be they're invited to just be outside, just to regulate themselves, to
Hmm.
jump up and down, or to just do something else, to have a little wander, and then come back in when they're ready.
Yeah.
And that's a different thing than being sent out. It's a chance to just get back to a point where you can learn. So the
Mm.
focus is different.
That is really key to me because so often the students in the provision where I work will say, I was just getting sent out all the time. And when you
Yeah,
unpick it, sometimes they will say, well, yeah, I did actually have a movement break card, or I was actually, allowed in some capacity to go to a different part of the school. But where they perhaps hadn't recognized in themselves that it was time to take that break, the member of staff has then said, you need to go and take said break. And their perception of that is, I've been sent out. So, what is it that your school is doing to avoid that kind of negative association? I like what you said about the regulating, but how is it being presented to the students so they don't feel like they are being sent out all the time?
it's actually talked about with the students. And because it starts early on in the school, by the time they're older, so when children are like 5 or 6 or 7,
Mm,
it's easy to talk about things like that. It would be more complicated when you're a teenager, but by then they're used to it.
mm. So, in essence, it goes back to that getting in early.
Yeah,
Prevention is better than cure, so to speak, and actually it becomes a cultural thing that that's what we do here.
exactly. Yes.
Yeah, that sounds so lovely, and I think if more people could take that on board, I think it's not going to solve everything, is it? But I think it would go a long way to addressing some of the unmet needs that we do see. Um, and I think that bit about regulation. I know when we were talking prior to the show about the content of today and what we're going to discuss, I know you mentioned trauma informed practice,
Mm.
and that idea of regulating and being ready to learn is really central to that. What else can you suggest or are you doing in your school that's linked to trauma informed practice?
Well, with trauma informed practice, can I just explain a bit about trauma informed
Of
practice?
course, of course you
Yeah.
can.
Okay. In essence, our autonomic nervous system, which is the bit that does the emotion regulation,
Mm,
in essence, is made up out of three parts. If you imagine a traffic light,
yeah.
if you think of the green, that's where you want to be in. That's where you're calm, you're connected, you can learn. Your heart rate is nice and slow, and your breathing is slow, and you're just in a good space.
Yeah.
But when your body, and it is your body, when your body senses danger, it's flipped into the amber. That's your fight or flight. So at
Mhm.
that moment, you get adrenaline and cortisol flooding your body, your heart rate goes up, your breathing goes up, your rational blood disappears from your rational thinking part of your brain, so
Mm,
that literally you cannot really think logically and think about what you're doing. Um, and at that point, that's often when children are seen as being difficult in the
mhm.
classroom. Now, if at that moment the child or the adult even cannot either run away or fight or anything, the body senses even greater danger and then flips into the red. Now, the red is the freeze. The freeze is where it, it almost looks like green because your heart rate goes down, your breathing goes down,
Mm.
your pupils sort of constrict. But at the same time, you get natural opioids flooding your body, so you're numb. So again, you cannot learn.
Mm.
So if you think about these three things, where we want to be in the green, um, that bit is actually not something we're born with. So the amber and the red, so the fight or flight and the freeze, those are
Mm.
survival states that we are born with. The
Yeah.
green we're supposed to learn. Now, if you're ADHD or neurodivergent in many ways, it probably means that your parents are as well. That means your parents might not have been very good at regulating their emotions. That means you've never learned from them through co regulation how to regulate your emotions.
Mm.
And that means that you're then in a school, your normal state is either the amber or the red. And so,
Okay.
what you need to do as a teacher is to recognize that, recognize where they are, and then the thing to do is then to have a space in the school where a child can go to, where they, first of all, they can calm down, like a sensory space, whatever, but also where there is someone who can actually talk them through that and sort of start them, co-regulate them.
That's I really like that traffic light analogy because again, in the setting where I work, we do a lot of trauma informed practice, but I've never heard it described in that way. And it's such a simple but powerful and effective way. I might just borrow that one off you
Yeah, feel
um,
free.
to share with people. So you've you've explained how those students are potentially going to be, I say feeling, but feeling in their body rather than it can lead to an emotional outburst, can't it? But you then talked about having that sensory space and someone who can talk things through with them. So, what impacts then are you seeing for that young person of having somebody to go and co regulate with?
The main one is the fact they start to feel safe. Now,
Mm.
feeling safe is part of that whole green zone. You
Yeah.
cannot learn if you don't feel safe. And to feel safe, you need to be understood. And when you're understood and co-regulated with, because our nervous systems, they talk to each other.
Yeah.
And so if the teacher remains really calm, or whoever the person is that they're with, if the child is dysregulated and the teacher remains really calm,
Mm.
the child will become calm. If the teacher also becomes dysregulated, you get this explosion happening
Mm.
between the child and the teacher. So actually, for um, the child, it is much better if the teacher can just stay calm. Obviously, that's not that easy to do because teachers
No.
also get triggered. Um, but it is really the essence of co-regulating is to be aware that if a child triggers you, it means that it's um, it's you that has to do the work.
Mm.
It's you that has to regulate yourself first before really dealing with it. So I think teachers need to be able, if they feel they're being triggered, they need to be able to just say, I just need 5 minutes out.
Yeah. And really, that's down to then sort of a similar way to what we're saying for students, isn't it? That they might need to take their time out because at the end of the day, we're all human beings and we all have these connections in our bodies, sort of between brain and body. Um, it doesn't matter what our job title is, does it? We're all human beings.
Exactly. And I think it's very important for the teachers to recognize that they are as easily triggered sometimes as
Mm.
the children, but it's very easy then to blame the child. Whereas, of
Yeah.
course, it's not necessarily the case that the child is to blame because the child got triggered too. So you're both being triggered.
Mm. And that is something that could be potentially quite difficult, I think, for staff to hear because there is still, to some extent, an expectation that, you know, I'm the adult, you're the child, you need to behave and do what I say. But actually, whilst there are obviously times when you need to give direction to children and information and instructions and everything else. But there are equally times when we need to meet people on a human level, aren't there?
Yes, and actually, I think that that connection is key to everything. One
Mm,
of the advantages of being ADHD myself is that I've never had that sense of authority, not when people are in authority of me
mm,
or when children, um, when I'm supposed to be authority over children. I've just never had it. So I've always seen them as more like equals, like when
mm,
you're a manager in a team and you're just managing the team, but it doesn't mean that you're the one who's the boss and tells them all what to do.
yeah.
Um, and that's really helped me because it means that you work more on connection rather than
Mm.
on telling children what to do.
That's such a lovely way of explaining how, I guess in a nutshell, sort of how you work with your class. And interesting that you said right at the beginning that you've always had the class with a lot of neurodivergent children in, because actually they are also the ones that, we all benefit from connection, but I think those children benefit even more.
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
and also for them it is so important that they are seen and that the positives are noticed. One of the things that I often see is that neurodivergent children, because they are different and they're often overstimulated, etc.,
Mm.
etc., it means that they're always noticed for the negative. They're always
Yeah.
noticed because they're misbehaving, because they're not doing something. Whereas that really saps away at their self-esteem. And so being able um, to be in a space to understand them well enough that you can actually notice things like
Mm.
um, okay, I know I could see that you were really struggling, but you managed to stay there and you managed to work through it. That is a really major thing for these children, if you can just
Mm.
recognize that.
And how lovely for them to have that acknowledged, because, like you say, they are so often picked up for not doing something or missing something or looking out of the window when they should have been looking at the whiteboard or something at the front of the room. Um, it must be lovely for them to have that level of connection with you. And I wonder if that has also had benefits in terms of parents and staff understanding as well. If you're, if as and when you're having conversations with the adults that support all these young people.
Yes, because I can share that understanding with them. Because, of course, if you're not neurodivergent yourself, um, teacher training isn't renowned for having that much information on it. And
No.
so you won't know. You think you're normal. Normal is one of those scary words, isn't it? Everyone
Yes.
always assumes normal is the way they are.
Mm,
But of course, normal is, there's so many different types of normal. Everyone is normal for them. And so everyone assumes that everyone else will respond the same way they do. It's a bit like learning. I've realized over time that what I struggle with is, for example, learning from videos. I just can't
mm,
do it. And
hmm.
nowadays everything's on videos. And
Yeah.
it made me realize that, you know, children that really struggle, for example, when things is just written down or when they're just hearing it, or there's so many different ways that people can learn. And if you always focus on just one way, you're missing out. You,
Mm,
those kids miss out. You always have a proportion of children in your class that just struggle with the learning.
yeah. That's really interesting, because if you go back sort of 10, 15 years, it was all about, are your learners, it was the VAK, wasn't it? Are they visual? Are they auditory? Are they kinesthetic? And the expectation was teachers would plan around those sort of three different areas, and some they may overlap, they may not. And it's largely something that we've moved away from. But I wonder if it's actually something that, whilst we don't need to plan our whole lesson around three, um, the VAK strands, there's still merit in having awareness of them, isn't there?
Yeah, and I think that that visual, auditory, kinesthetic thing was just too simplified as well,
Mm,
because there's so many steps in learning. I mean, I'm very aware that, for example, for me to learn something, I need to hear it, but I also need to read it at the same time, and I have to write notes. I write notes not because I'll ever look at the notes again, but the action of writing the notes will help me get it into my memory.
mm,
Um, and that's how I learn. I also know other. Uh, I've had a lot of students, particularly dyslexic students, who learn much better if they can draw while they're learning, while they're
mm,
listening,
mm.
because for them that bit helps them. And again, they may never look at it again, but that's okay because it's not about that. It's about the action of doing it.
Yeah. And I think actually that just mirrors our general experience, isn't it? There's lots of times when, whether it's, in your general class, your class of 30, and you ask them to, I don't know what they're doing, writing an essay about something, or if they're in history and they're analysing something, and actually they're not that likely to ever go back and read that again. But
Yeah.
something about that learning has, added to their experience, added to their memories, and is something they can draw on later in time. So what you say there about having somebody with dyslexia, doodling while they're doing something else, I think, yeah, like you say, it doesn't matter, does it?
No, and also I think what people forget is that there's two parts of education. There's the facts that you learn, which somehow I don't think anyone really remembers them. And what people forget is because if the facts are not actually that important, it's the skills you learn that are
Mm.
important. Those are the bits that stay. So um, figuring out how you learn, for example, to me is one of those skills that uh, you will that will stay with you for life.
That's so important as well in a world that is changing so rapidly, that actually we give our students the skills that they can then take and adapt and use, rather than learning by rote. I mean, there's obviously a place for facts, particularly things like times tables, but yeah, knowledge is only one part of it, as you say. And just going back, before we go to a break for the news, just going back to one thing you said about you learning how you learn, again, from that point of view of, that lived experience of having ADHD, what does that bring in terms of how you support your students for them to learn how they learn?
I'm much more able to ask the right questions. So one of the things I do is all the access arrangements for exams, for example.
Yeah.
And whereas it's supposed to be the assessments that are the important part, but actually for me, it's the questions I ask them
Hmm.
around the assessment, how things work, what they did, and why they did it that way, what worked for them. Those are the important bits. And
Yeah.
I can observe them and I can spot things that I would otherwise not have been able to spot, simply because I know all the different possibilities there are of what might be difficult.
Yeah. There's Anita, it's been fascinating hearing from you, and I think the biggest thing for me, listening to what you say, not only your passion for your role and how you've kind of interweaved things from your own experience, but actually it's lots of little things that are quite, or should be quite, straightforward for people to put into place. What you've not said is go away and spend thousands of pounds on this, that, and the other that we know schools haven't got. You've actually shared lots of practical, quite simple to put in place, but effective strategies. So I think that's something that's going to be really valuable to people who are listening. So thank you very much. I'm sure we could talk for hours on all of this. But what I'm going to do now is take a break. So we will hear the news and from our sponsors, and then Anita will come back because I know you also kindly said you would share with us something completely different, which was around your your child and their experiences of school. So, as I say, we'll take a break now and then we'll hear from you in a few minutes' time. Thank you, Anita.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading!
Are you a teacher who has concerns about your students' low reading levels? Are you also worried disadvantaged students won't be able to catch up? The online reading development program, Dreambox Reading Plus, adapts to a student's skill level, accelerates reading progress, and helps students acquire a wide vocabulary. The patented technology develops reading fluency and supports the transition to increased text complexity from Key Stage 2 to Key Stage 3 and 4, where language and vocabulary are more challenging. You can try the program with a free 4-week pilot today. Search Reading Solutions UK to find their website and request your free pilot.
How do we stop teachers marking books on their kitchen table on a Sunday night instead of wanting to spend time with their family? Is live marking truly cutting-edge practice? What if I told you that I could provide evidence of verbal feedback and its impact on student outcomes? Now, traditional marking, time and time again, is reported as the #1 reason why teachers leave the profession. It trumps behaviour issues and teacher salary. In Guide to Feedback, I share 9 case study skills that demonstrate 9 different ways to provide marking and feedback, all evidenced by student outcomes. Now, not every school will be ready for this, but hopefully you are ready to start your Feed Up and Feed Forward journey.
The Teacher Toolkit Guide to Feedback is out now, and you can get an exclusive 30% discount when you order Teacher Toolkit Guide to Feedback from bloomsbury.com. Just use the code TTRGTF at the checkout. That's TTRGTF, and it expires 30th of November. Happy reading.
Do you ever wish you could sit down with other teachers and delve into the challenges and opportunities we face? Well, that's exactly what Table Talks at Bet UK is all about. Join small roundtable discussions based on your selected topics to share insights, learn from peers, and tackle the big issues in education, all in a sponsor-free environment. This is your chance to connect and collaborate like never before. Be part of the conversation at Bet UK in January 2025. Visit uk.betshow.com to learn more.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
Schools Week focuses on 6 key findings from an annual parent survey. According to the article, most parents said school absence fines would not deter them from taking their child on holiday during term time, with the majority saying it's fine to skip classes to get away. Half of parents say they oppose the policy of fining parents when their child misses school for more than 5 days without good reason or authorisation. Parentkind is calling for the government to review the pricing and marketing of family holidays. The Parentkind survey of all 4 home nations reveals other key findings, which include a quarter of parents considering home education for their children. 2/3 of the parents who have considered homeschooling had children eligible for free school meals, compared with 1/3 from non-free school meal pupils, raising concerns again about the gap between those from disadvantaged backgrounds compared to their non-disadvantaged peers. 1 in 5 parents think that there are too many GCSEs taken by pupils, but only 1/3 of parents thought maths should be studied until the age of 18. 90% of parents thought school reports were useful, and 89% felt this way about parents' evenings too. But support for homework was only at 70%. Nearly 4 in 10 parents said homework causes arguments, which rose to 48% for free school meal eligible pupils. Full details of all the survey's findings can be found on the Schools Week website. An ITV report says the Welsh Government continues to change its position on how to teach English reading. An investigation revealed that a method which has been discredited for decades is being widely used in schools across Wales. The method, commonly referred to as cueing, sees children being told to use cues like pictures or the context of a sentence if they are stuck on an unfamiliar word. The Welsh Conservatives forced a debate in the Senedd based on the investigation, and the government admitted the guidance needed to be clarified, with a spokesperson saying to ITV News that cueing should not be used to tackle unfamiliar words. However, in an interview, the Cabinet Secretary for Education, Lynn Neagle, said cueing could be used to teach reading with phonics as the building blocks as part of a balanced approach. Scientists are concerned that using cueing methods with children whose English skills are already behind when they start school only makes things worse. According to the ITV report, some secondary schools say more children than ever are arriving at school in Year 7 unable to decode words, and that reading ages are below chronological ages. Full details of the report can be found online. In Scotland, the BBC reports that IT failures in Edinburgh meant primary school pupils had access to pornography and videos of executions at public libraries. Filters designed to block inappropriate websites were not activated on PCs accessed using child library cards. According to the BBC, the City of Edinburgh Council believed the issue was resolved earlier this month, until it was discovered that this revised safety measure could also be easily bypassed. All public computers in the city's libraries were taken offline again until the issue could be rectified. Younger pupils are sometimes taken to libraries to use computers during the school day. A parent reported the breach to their child's school, and this was passed on to the council. School-issued iPads were taken away from pupils to check they were secure. A spokeswoman for the City of Edinburgh Council said it was reviewing its security measures. Finally, students at the University of Cambridge have been offered heart screenings after a 20-year-old undergraduate suffered a sudden cardiac arrest. The student collapsed and died whilst hiking in France in 2023, but friends have since raised more than £55,000 to pay for ECGs for hundreds of students. The original goal was to raise £7,000, but now many more will be able to access the tests to check for undiagnosed issues. This has been your Teachers Talk Radio News with Jo Fox.
Welcome back, and thank you as always to our sponsors and to Jo there for the news. We have had a fascinating session already earlier in the show with Anita Hempenius sharing all sorts of tips and advice from the perspective of somebody who has ADHD and is also a SENCO. And I loved, Anita, what you said about creating a culture where things like taking a movement break is seen as a positive rather than being seen as sent out of the room, and particularly around not just managing the need at that point in time in terms of behaviour, but also supporting the mental health and the self-esteem of our young people. Now, Anita, you really kindly said you would join me for the second half of the show as well to take things in a slightly different direction. And interestingly, actually, in the news, they mentioned about homeschooling because that is one of the things that you have some direct experience of. And I just wondered if you would be able to share a little bit more about the circumstances there around home education. And I know you mentioned that to me that it was to do with supporting your daughter.
Yes, my youngest daughter, uh, we adopted her when she was almost 6.
Okay.
So that meant that her background clearly was full of trauma and stuff.
Mm.
And because of that, first she just went to school, and it was only when I realized that she was not actually learning anything that I started to think about, what else can we do? So basically, she would be in a classroom,
Mm.
and she would just be hyper vigilant. she would just be constantly looking around, making sure everything is safe, seeing what's going on. So clearly, she was continually in that, what we're talking about before, about the traffic light thing.
Mm.
She was continually in amber. And because if you're in amber, if you're constantly looking around for danger, you're not going to be able to learn.
Mm.
So then, when we knew the SATs were coming up, so this was so it was in year 5 that I really started to think, next year is going to be the SATs. If she's already struggling and already hypervigilant, that's going to be a disaster. So
Yeah.
originally, I decided to take her out for 1 year, for the SATs year.
Hmm.
And then when I did, it worked so well that we decided to keep it going for a few more years. And she went back into school in beginning of year 9.
Okay. So actually, she had sort of quite a chunk then away. She missed the SATs, but missed that sort of transition into secondary school as well. Um,
Yes.
and over, you mentioned that she was hypervigilant all the time, and that meant she wasn't able to learn. What do you think it was about school, the environment, the system, whatever it was, that sort of triggered that response in her?
I think it was not really to do with the school so much. I think it was to
Mm,
do with her background. So she, like before, I was talking about the whole trauma states, the
mm,
emotional regulation states. She had not learned to be regulated,
okay.
and so if her normal was to be in amber. So if
Yeah.
if you're always in amber, you always got adrenaline and cortisol flooding your body. Your heart's racing all the time. You're going to blood will have moved away from like your prefrontal cortex, so
Mm,
reasoning is not as easy. So basically, you're not in a state to
yeah.
learn. And I think by that point, because when we adopted her, she was already at school. She hadn't had that period at home to really learn how to regulate by co-regulating with us. And
Wow.
I think the time at home gave her that opportunity.
There's so much to what you've just said, and there's clearly a lot around the connection then that you can really build and establish with her when she's at home with you, or, for much more time than if she was at school. But I just want to give people perhaps something in terms of relating to it for themselves. You mentioned there about cortisol and adrenaline and all those things kind of flooding around our body, making it difficult for us to function properly. That's actually, you talked about it in terms of the trauma and the being able to regulate, but actually that's very similar to what we would term as adults a stress response. When we've got too much going on, too many decisions to make, the to-do list is never ending, and actually we just can't see the wood for the trees. So I think perhaps for people listening, whilst they may not have experienced the level of trauma that unfortunately some of our young people have had, they may have had an experience that has parallels. Would that be fair?
Yes, and also it's important to recognize that with neurodivergent children, for example,
Mm.
there's automatically a trauma because they will have gone through their whole life up to that point of not being understood, of being told off
Hmm.
for things because they couldn't do them when they couldn't do them.
Yeah.
And that in itself is a trauma. And also, if you think about anxiety sits in that amber state. So anyone who's had anxiety will know exactly what I mean when I say about the sort of adrenaline and the cortisol and the heart racing, because they know what that feels like, having a panic attack or just being
Mm.
really anxious.
Yeah. And that so often, I think, gets missed. Like you say, students get told off, they get reminded for things that actually they genuinely do not have any control over, or very, very limited control. And the impact on them over time. We see, don't we, now the waiting list for CAMS, the waiting list for counselling, for all sorts of mental health services is just astronomical. And I think hearing what you're saying, in many ways, if little changes had happened earlier on, we perhaps wouldn't be in that situation. And I wonder for you and your daughter, you've obviously seen a lot of positives, a lot of benefits. And I wonder if you could just share a few of what those have been.
Yes, there's very many. Um, First of all, let's just think about the learning part itself.
Mm.
When I took her out of school, she struggled to read and write at all. So this was like end of year 5. Okay. A few years later, by that point, she was reading the classics like
Wow.
Jane Austen and stuff. Um, and that was in such a short period of time. And a lot of that was because the pressure was off.
Mm.
When you're home educating, you actually only do about 2 hours a day because
Mm.
that's all you need. And then for the rest, the child is time to just de-stress, to just be themselves,
Mm.
to find hobbies. That's the other bit I really noticed, that she developed hobbies, and she'd never done that before.
Mm.
So she was developing hobbies and her own passions. She began to sing, and she
Mhm.
really focused on that and got really good at that. And she did needlecraft and all these different things, which because she only had 2 hours of actual typical sort of education, she had
Mm.
time for everything else. So that was a
I
really big one.
Yeah. I think there's possibly people listening will go, "What? Only 2 hours? That's not enough." But actually, if you are working with somebody, presumably on a sort of one-to-one, it's a much more close connection. It's, I suppose, much more intense. I guess you're able to cover a lot more, and as you say, you've got someone who's much less stressed to begin with, so they're more ready to learn. Would that be
Yes, but
fair?
also because the bits I focused on for learning were the basics. So there were numeracy, English, and some science stuff. That was really what I
Mm.
focused on. Everything else we did in trips out. We go to museums. You learn a lot in museums. So
Yeah.
I would make her take a sketchbook and sketch things and put little notes with it. Or we'd go up to London to some of the talks there, for example.
Mm.
Or we'd go out in nature. We'd go on a dog walk, and then while we're there, we're looking at the plants and the soil. We might dig into the soil and see what that is like. So you learn a lot, but it's not pure academic. It's more you're
Mm.
learning by doing and by observing, which is just a different way of learning.
Yeah.
But the actual academic part was literally 2 hours a day.
And I really love what you said about how your daughter had really developed some passions, and particularly things like the singing, because we do a lot in schools where we try and motivate children essentially with a sort of a carrot, isn't it? You get a gold star, or you'll get house points, merit awards, dojo points, all these different things that schools use. But actually, what you're talking about is somebody who's learning because they want to learn, that they've really developed like an intrinsic desire to learn rather than somebody telling them they have to learn.
Yes, I must admit, I don't even agree with the extrinsic motivation, like all the stickers and things, because I don't think it's particularly useful because surely you want children to want to learn.
Mm,
So for me, the intrinsic bit is much more important.
that's and again, for somebody who perhaps has social and emotional mental health difficulties from before, to find something that they really love and they really connect with. Actually, we talk about that a lot of the time, with well-being such a priority now in schools. And it's just about to be half term, literally started this evening for some people. For others it might be that the end of their half term week, and we always say, don't we, go and spend time in nature, go and relax, pick up your hobbies. And actually what you're saying is your daughter can do that all the time, which must be amazing for her.
Yes, yeah, it was
Yeah,
amazing for her. And
yeah.
it was really odd to see that shift again when she went back to school.
And
It didn't disappear completely,
mm.
but then that whole social thing took over for a while, and that became her passion, I guess.
Yeah. And I was that was sort of leads quite nicely because I was going to say to you, you've painted a really positive picture, but I wonder what challenges you did come across, whether that was around going back into school or, you know, having one person with you around a lot of the time. Were there any challenges or what did you do about them?
Yeah, can I just first mention one more positive that
Of course.
I forgot to mention before? Because the connection between her and me
Mm,
intensified so much. Because if you think about it, our kids spend so much of the day at school,
mm,
we don't really see them that much. So to have someone around all the time, you really get to know them and you really bond with them very strongly. So that was a real positive.
mm.
The difficulty for me was trying to make a living when
Yeah.
you're home educated. That was like really difficult. Um, and but for the rest, because I know people always worry about, the social connections and not being around their peers. But
Mm,
actually, in the whole home ed communities, you meet up together. So
mm,
they do. They have sport things. They have different places where they go to meet each other, and there's a joy in being in groups where it's not everyone of the same age, where they're all going
mm,
through exactly the same developmental issues at exactly the same time, which sort of intensifies them.
mm.
So when you're in a group where there's different ages, you have that a lot less. Somehow it
Wow.
feels more natural to me.
Yeah. That's something I had never thought about because that is one of the big questions, and in my role as a Senko, I had families saying to me at various times, "Oh, I'm wondering about homeschooling or, for a period, a bit like yourself, for a period of time to give the child essentially a little bit of respite, a reset, and then, go back into school when the next phase, into secondary or into upper school, whatever." Um, but the concern was always around losing that social interaction. But actually, what you've described is again actually a big positive, I think.
Yeah, and in schools there is actually not that much social interaction because they're in class.
Hmm.
Whereas when you're home educating, even if you do groups, because I did odd groups as well where it had more children, there's more interaction because the groups are smaller.
So, in essence, what we're getting at is sort of quality over quantity, I think.
Yes.
Yeah, I love that. I really do. Um, Anita, I'm going to just ask you one more thing about your sort of experience in terms of home education. We will then hear from our sponsors once again and then have a little bit of a sort of summing up as we come to the end of the show in a few minutes. But I just wonder, having had that experience of home educating your daughter, and I love your reasons and I love all of the positives that you've shared. Has that had an impact on you in terms of your Senko role?
Oh, yes, it has had a massive impact because because not only have I got that experience, so I can see what really benefits some children,
Mm.
but also um, we've in the school where I'm now. Sorry, I've just got a bit of a frog in my throat here.
Oh,
In the school where I'm now, we've had children that have been home educated and that are slowly coming back in. And I have much more of a feel for how slow that should be and not to try and push it
mm.
because the whole important thing is for that child to feel safe.
That's such a lovely thought to, I say, finish this section of the show on. Not rushing, taking our time, and really making sure that things are working for somebody before we expect more of them. Because I think, that's, the society we live in is rush, rush, rush. It's do things now, don't miss out, get it done. And actually, we would all benefit from slowing down and taking a little bit more time. So that's brilliant, and I really do love what you said there. So, as I say, we're going to take a short break to hear once again from our sponsors, and then we'll kind of bring things together. There's been so much in this one show. I'm not sure how I'm going to manage that, but we'll do our best in a few minutes' time.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading!
Are you a teacher who has concerns about your students' low reading levels? Are you also worried disadvantaged students won't be able to catch up? The online reading development program, Dreambox Reading Plus, adapts to a student's skill level, accelerates reading progress, and helps students acquire a wide vocabulary. The patented technology develops reading fluency and supports the transition to increased text complexity from Key Stage 2 to Key Stage 3 and 4, where language and vocabulary are more challenging. You can try the program with a free 4-week pilot today. Search Reading Solutions UK to find their website and request your free pilot.
How do we stop teachers marking books on their kitchen table on a Sunday night instead of wanting to spend time with their family? Is live marking truly cutting-edge practice? What if I told you that I could provide evidence of verbal feedback and its impact on student outcomes? Now, traditional marking, time and time again, is reported as the #1 reason why teachers leave the profession. It trumps behaviour issues and teacher salary. In Guide to Feedback, I share 9 case study skills that demonstrate 9 different ways to provide marking and feedback, all evidenced by student outcomes. Now, not every school will be ready for this, but hopefully you are ready to start your Feed Up and Feed Forward journey.
The Teacher Toolkit Guide to Feedback is out now, and you can get an exclusive 30% discount when you order Teacher Toolkit Guide to Feedback from bloomsbury.com. Just use the code TTRGTF at the checkout. That's TTRGTF, and it expires 30th of November. Happy reading.
Do you ever wish you could sit down with other teachers and delve into the challenges and opportunities we face? Well, that's exactly what Table Talks at Bet UK is all about. Join small roundtable discussions based on your selected topics to share insights, learn from peers, and tackle the big issues in education, all in a sponsor-free environment. This is your chance to connect and collaborate like never before. Be part of the conversation at Bet UK in January 2025. Visit uk.betshow.com to learn more.
Thank you very much there to our sponsors once again for supporting Teachers Talk Radio. We have heard from Anita Hempenius twice this evening. So a show of sort of 2 halves, but they are connected. We started off looking at being a SENCO when you have a neurodivergence yourself and what that can bring and how that enhances the role. And I thought really lovely that Anita, for you, that was about recognizing the strengths of the students, finding the things that they are good at, and really shaping the culture in your school around how those students are supported. And then moving on to a decision you made to actually take your daughter out of school and work with her in a sort of home education sense for a couple of years before she went back in. So you have given us a huge amount to think about, and thank you very much for being here on a Friday evening. I just wonder, as we come to the end of our show, what sort of top tips, strategies, what would you say to people if they could do 1 or 2 things differently after the half term? what is it that they could do and put into place pretty much straight away that's going to really have an impact on students with additional needs?
I would say the very first thing is to really get to know the students,
Mm,
to really figure out what makes them tick and really to learn their behavior, to see their behavior as the form of communication it is.
hmm
So that when they are dysregulated, it's not that they want to be dysregulated. All children inherently want to learn.
mm,
That's just part of who we are. So if they are not, there's a reason for it.
yeah.
And
And
to really start thinking of that and to start forming that bond with the students.
yes, and that piece there about behaviour being communication, I am absolutely on board with that, and I really do believe in that. But it's something that quite often gets a bit of a bad reputation with people seeing it as allowing students to behave so-called badly. And I just wonder what your response is to those sorts of arguments.
To me, it's really the same thing as if you think as adults,
Mm,
if you're struggling and you get really angry at someone and you start shouting at them, and then afterwards you feel really embarrassed. For
hmm
children, it's the same. So if we accept adults that say things like, "Oh, I just had to leave the classroom for a moment. These kids are driving me crazy."
Yeah.
If they can say that, then that child also needs to have that opportunity
Mm,
to think, to say, like, I need to leave for a moment. So I think anything that you wouldn't do to an adult,
mm.
you shouldn't do to a child.
And that idea of, we have, haven't we? I think there's probably not many of us, if any at all, that can say, you haven't got cross with someone and walked out of a room, slammed the door, shouted at them, and then don't you feel awful afterwards because you just think, oh, that's not really. I shouldn't have behaved that way. I know I shouldn't have done that. And those feelings of shame and embarrassment and guilt are very real. And then you add in a child with neurodivergence, a child who is a child, therefore their emotional regulation systems are not fully developed by default. You've, absolutely, if you wouldn't do it to an adult, you definitely shouldn't be doing it to a child, should you?
Yeah,
Okay, well, I'll say I was thinking as we had as we were hearing from our sponsors, and as I said just before, I'm actually struggling to find a way to sum up everything because you've given us so much this evening. But I just want to pick on a few standout things for me. One was your traffic light analogy in terms of students being regulated or in the fight or flight mode and then freeze. That's something we hear a lot, but I'd not heard it explained in such a clear way before. So thank you for that. Um, and then what you said actually not long ago about the decision to home educate sometimes comes with questions around, oh, how are the students going to develop their social skills? But when you mentioned about the home education groups, and actually they're then with a real mix of ages, and presumably that can be anything from sort of beginning of primary right through to top end of secondary, what you get is the benefit of not having everybody going through, for example, puberty at the same time, or everybody, having a certain issue just because of their age. So, some real positives there. And thank you for highlighting those because I think they are things that we just, unless you've experienced it, unless you have been there, I don't think people would ever have realized. So, you really have opened some eyes this evening, especially for me. So, thank you. And I just wanted to come back to you once more, just before we finish, and say, is there anything else you would like to share as a sort of closing comment as we do conclude the show?
I think the only thing I would say is that when teaching, the most important thing is to be kind always.
I really, really do endorse that. Be kind. If you don't do anything else, please be kind. Anita, I can't really think of anything else to say to that other than a huge thank you, because it has been fascinating talking to you. We could have gone on for hours, and I will definitely be in touch with you after the show, because it has been a genuine pleasure hearing all of your fascinating thoughts, insights, tips, all sorts you've shared with us this evening. And thank you to our listeners as well. If you've been listening live, appreciate you being here on a Friday evening. And if you're listening on the podcast, thank you very much for downloading the show. Please do keep an eye out for other shows that are coming up. There's a huge range over the next couple of weeks, even though it is half term. We carry on at Teachers Talk Radio. We will be here with you for the weekly review and for all of the shows that happen through Monday through to Friday. So if you are listening live, I'm going to say thank you and have a lovely weekend. And if you are listening on the podcast as a catch up, please do enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much once again to Anita, and take care. Goodbye.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.